Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see a full house again. It's good to know that there is a real keen interest in international politics and engaging with contemporary affairs from a multidisciplinary yet academic perspective. So I'm delighted to have another panel with colleagues, friends, that will hopefully shed a bit of light on what's happened in recent weeks with regard to President Trump's withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear program. So we'll kick off with Professor James A. Sweeney from the law school. Then we'll hand over to Dr. Mark Garnett, who will talk about the British and American contexts. And then, whisper it. And then we'll have Miss Samira Nasirzadeh. Yes, I got that. Who will talk about the Iranian context. So then we'll open the floor to general Q&A and hopefully have an interesting discussion. So
you're going to say something as well, Simon.
At some point I will say something about geopolitics, maybe. So, James,
okay.
Over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is James Sweeney. Simon said I'm a professor from the law school, so I'm going to kick things off by just saying a few words about what was in and what wasn't in the plan of action, the so-called deal with Iran that President Trump has announced that the USA will be withdrawing from. Just before we do that, I just want to take a straw poll. First of all, who approves of the USA backing out of this? Backing out of the deal. There's always one. Who disapproves? Okay. Who's read the deal? Who's read UN Security Council Resolution 2231/2015 backing the deal? Just me then. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. And I think it's important to have a look at some of those texts because the devil is often in the detail. I mean, remember just recently when Sarah Sanders declared that the newly unveiled Israeli intelligence proved that Iran has a robust clandestine nuclear weapons program. Apparently that being a grammatic error, she meant to say had, which they certainly did until at least 2003. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is show you how President Trump has repeatedly misrepresented the content and potentially the legal status of the deal. This will probably come as no surprise for anyone that has been following the ramblings of everyone's favourite semi-literate, self-confessed sex pest and serial liar. But what I'm going to do now is to say, first take you through the legal status and then look at a bit of the content. In terms of the legal status then, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, has described it as an agreement. US negotiator Brian Hock has said it's not an agreement, despite Iran saying it is. That's why it's called a plan of action, he says. The agreement is not a treaty. The plan of action, should I say, is not a treaty. And there's, I've seen similar responsible arguments made along that route. To me, it's not quite as clear as that. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is a treaty about treaties from 1969, says that something can be a treaty, whatever its particular designation. And that's why the European Convention on Human Rights is a treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is a treaty. What matters is what it is, not what it's called. So it being called a plan of action, to me, simply isn't decisive. There is an argument that because the plan of action makes reference to voluntary measures, that precludes it from being treated as a treaty. I don't think it's as simple as that, because whenever a state signs a treaty, they undertake to abide by voluntarily to abide by the obligations that they've signed up to. It's all based on state consent. You consent to be bound by the treaty that you have voluntarily entered into. Admittedly, though, I think showing, or in a sense proving state consent to be bound by this agreement as a treaty would be more difficult. But the question about status doesn't stop there. You could look at UN Security Council Resolution 2231/2015 that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which was adopted unanimously, and under it was adopted unanimously and backed the agreement. Now, under Article 25 of the UN Charter, members of the UN agree to be bound by the UN Security Council resolutions. So that is a route to show that there's some sort of binding legal force to the agreement. I think the smarter move, though, in my opinion, to get some sort of legal traction here and to use the terms of the agreement, would be to use what's known as the snapback process in Articles 11 to 13 of the UN Security Council resolution. Here, if one state, USA, alleges Iran is not complying with the plan of action, then the Security Council has to adopt a resolution deciding whether to continue the suspension of sanctions. Okay? And it says that if they can't come to an agreement, then the sanctions, over a period of time, then the sanctions will automatically be reinstated. Okay? All the US has to do is stick within the agreement, allege Iran is not complying, force the UN Security Council to consider voting to maintain the sanctions. And as I say, even if then Russia or whoever vetoed it, the effect of the veto would still be that the sanctions would come back into effect. So one might argue that perhaps uncharacteristically, Trump has withdrawn prematurely. Moving on now to the content of it, as I said, it'd be no surprise that perhaps some of it's being misrepresented. I have a quote from the 30th where President Trump said, "In 7 years that deal would have expired and Iran is free to go ahead and create nuclear weapons. That's not acceptable. 7 years is tomorrow." No, it's not. That's literally not true. He later modified it to the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. A sunset provision is a common phrase in American law where there's an agreement that a particular law will cease to exist after a period of time. And he seems to have got it into his head that there's this magic number that in 7 years' time the agreement will sort of cease to bind. Now there is a major transition after 8 years, and a termination of the agreement after 10, but only if Iran is in compliance. For the reasons I've just said, if they're not, it will carry on. But then if you look in the detail, there's sections on uranium enrichment, sections on a new plant at Arak, a section on transparency and confidence building measures. I could go on. They each contain sort of things like there'll be limitations on uranium enrichment for the first 8 years, Iran's enrichment research and development with uranium for 10 years will only include IR4, IR5, IR6 and IR8 centrifuges. I have literally no idea what that means, but it says a period of time. Then it says, based on its long-term plan for 15 years, Iran will carry out its uranium enrichment activities in a particular place, in a particular way. So already there we've got a multiplicity of time frames. Again, in relation to this new plant at Arak, there will be no heavy water reactors or accumulation of heavy water in Iran for 15 years. In the transparency and confidence building bit, it says that the IAEA monitoring of uranium ore, concentrate produced by Iran, will be able to investigate for the next 25 years. Okay. So, the other point, well, so we can see there that Trump was clearly misrepresenting the content. Perhaps he couldn't read it, I don't know. We could also just point out here that even if the plan of action is a treaty, whatever it is, it's not the only law here. There is, of course, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to which Iran is a party. And Iran is committed to ratifying the IAEA's additional protocol by 2023. And Article 11 of the Plan of Action expressly says that nothing in this Plan of Action, whatever it is, affects those other legal commitments. Now, interestingly, and I will sort of agree that there was some value to Mr. Netanyahu's interesting PowerPoint presentation recently. Whilst I don't think that that presentation in fact shows any material breach by Iran of the plan of action, it could potentially, in fact, show a modest breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's on the basis that the materials Netanyahu drew attention to show that Iran has kept hold of some documents that would be useful were you to want to create nuclear weapons. And that is a technical breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Likewise, the documents reinforce the notion that, or should I say, they reinforce the belief that Iran certainly was developing nuclear weapons up until 2003. Iran having signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty many years before that. So, what can we say? The agreement actually, I think, was carefully negotiated. It reads well as a matter of law. Some international law doesn't. English lawyers are trained to hang on every word, every bit of grammar. It's actually pretty well done as far as I can see. And crucially, there was this snapback procedure in place, whereby if any state, including the US, any state party to it, should I say, including the US, thought that Iran was misbehaving, then they can use the agreement itself to force the reimposition of the sanctions. If the US fails to comply with the agreement by unilaterally, let's say, slapping sanctions back on Iran, the whole agreement crumbles and that mechanism disappears. Thank you.
Really interesting legal background to the deal and to what's actually going on with it. So I think where that leaves us then is a set of political decisions that shaped Mr. Trump's own decisions, some political contexts that fed into the decision to pull out of the deal. So this is where hopefully Mark can shed a bit of light on this.
Yeah, well, thank you, James. I mean, certainly the last bit shows the way in which the deal, whatever plan of action, has been distorted, but also, you may say, hasn't really been very well explained to the public. And so that's incredibly useful. So what I want to just talk a little bit about the American context, but also, because I'm very parochial in my mindset, a little bit about Britain, because Britain obviously has been involved, if only on the margins of all this. First of all, I think the decision of Mr. Trump to pull out of the deal, to renege on this deal, can be seen in the context generally of his approach to politics, which is characterised in a word which increasingly undergraduates seem to want to write dissertations about, one of populism. And I think the electorate, the audience for political actors, is understood by political scientists in all kinds of different ways. Now I'm going to be incredibly simplistic, which I prefer doing, and just say that you could divide the electorate in terms certainly of foreign policy decisions into three broad groups. The uninformed and uninterested, the people who, when asked by surveys, don't give an opinion because they're honest enough to admit that they neither know nor care about the issue. The partially informed, people who've got glimmerings of knowledge, but things which perhaps wouldn't pass any rigorous tests to qualify as knowledge. People who've got impressions and feelings about a particular issue, state, whatever. And then finally the experts. Now there used to be a time when policy was made by politicians in conjunction with experts, and those politicians would only feel safe to undergo a particular process if they felt the experts were in concurrence with what they intended to do. That was the old style of politics. Evidence-based policy, you might say, and this is exactly where James's thing comes in, that a deal of the kind with Iran would be one which is thrashed out amongst experts, hopefully satisfying those experts, and then there'd be some kind of hope that because the experts agreed with it and thought it was a good thing, that the partially informed would kind of fall behind that particular policy line. What Mr. Trump has realised, and other politicians have realised, is that because in this rather strange twist on, we're supposed to live in meritocratic democratic societies where people in positions of power owe their positions not to birth anymore, but to their abilities. But for some strange reason, there's been a reaction against the cult of the expert, and experts are now actually seen, if you've got experts on your side, then the likelihood is that you're certainly at a disadvantage against the people who tap into the partially informed. In short, I would say what we have now is a mass army of the partially informed who would like to think that partial information is perfectly adequate to make political decisions either at the ballot box or even in office. And what Mr. Trump has done with Iran, you might say, is to first of all satisfy a particular lobby which we all know about in the United States. I think that's one thing, but I think for him the better, the more profitable line with this is to activate and work upon the prejudices of the partially informed. And Iran clearly is a state which evokes negative connotations. I would imagine, I haven't seen polling on this, but I would imagine that the Iran deal was regarded by American domestic opinion with a certain amount of incredulity, because the hostage crisis, the late 70s, etc., America's greatest foreign policy humiliation, even one would say greater, more painful than the Vietnam imbroglio, that Iran being such a evocative, negatively evocative state, that there would be always a potential pool of opinion in America of the partially informed who were ready to turn against the deal, who would be ready to see that America sitting down, making any kind of compromise with the Iranian regime, must be betraying America's role in the world, America's image of itself, and that somebody standing up and simply tearing up the agreement is not in a position is not under any necessity to explain the details of what is done. Because the dog whistle elements of this is that the partially informed will think, good, we're tearing up an agreement with a state, we should never make this agreement in the first place. So from the domestic policy angle, there's all the other considerations that one might want to bring in. However, the fact that a decision was needed for Mr. Trump, it was a complete no-brainer. That, again, the partially informed would have found it very difficult to understand why he'd gone along with this agreement. So it's not just that he made an election pledge. I don't think Mr. Trump thinks election pledges are necessarily sacrosanct. It was just that this particular election pledge was one which, for him, fed into his general style of politics, which is anti-expert, in favour of, I mean, he is basically the patron saint of the partially informed. Then if we go to Britain, which in many respects, I think the electorate can be, for the sake of argument, divided into the same three categories. The only thing about Britain is that what we've found in recent times is that people who say this policy is wrong because the experts don't agree with it, that kind of person, even more so I would say than in the United States, is regarded as patronising, and it's almost an argument-quashing rebuke that you can say, I think that this policy is right because I actually know about it. That kind of thing is just not political good manners anymore. It's basically a recipe for you to be described as an elitist, etc. And that really explains, I don't know what really explains. We have in Britain a scenario where I would say probably our leading populist, although there are several applicants for the post, but Mr. Boris Johnson, James gave a very colourful description of Mr. Trump, characterising him, and I was thinking he was talking about Boris Johnson, actually, in terms of certain aspects of his life, which obviously I don't want to talk about. But we have the spectacle of Boris Johnson going over to America and, first of all, taking a populist platform, you know, Mr. Trump's favourite television outlet, what's it? Good Morning America, Let's Have 10 Minutes Hate, or whatever it's called. Wake Up and Hate. That's what we're going to... Wake Up and Hate, that would be a great title for it. But anyway, so Boris Johnson goes on a populist platform, but basically expounds an argument which is the old-fashioned one, kind of saying, this is a reasonable deal, it's the best we can get, we shouldn't tear it up. So he's conveying a non-populist argument on a populist platform, which I'm saying, it's this kind of postmodern political cross-dressing going on. But furthermore, Mr. Johnson was peddling a message which implied something contrary to what he's been peddling consistently since he decided that for tactical reasons he would present himself as an anti-European. Mr. Johnson was basically saying the Europeans are right and the Americans are wrong. And so what you've got here is the British government in the midst of a negotiation to withdraw from the European Union, and I totally accept that, of course, Britain can continue to agree on foreign policy issues with the European Union. However, the referendum was very much, I think, hinging in a lot of people's minds, in the minds of the partially informed, that if there's a choice between Britain in Europe and Britain in cahoots with the United States wins all the time. What Boris Johnson is saying is that the experts are right, the Europeans are right, and that basically rubbing the noses of the partially informed in the evidence. And usually I would say in Britain, again, I don't know about the polling, but I'd imagine that, again, Iran is seen as a state we shouldn't really be doing business with, and I think the opinion will be mixed. The final twist in this, just again, I'm going off the Iran tangent, but Mr. Johnson, again, just to show how the populist mindset works, given that he was on a tour where he was trying to be populist but conveying an anti-populist message, he decided that he would leave the United States with one last bit of populism where he characterised the Prime Minister's approach to Brexit, preferred deal with the customs arrangements. He referred to that as crazy. So the populist, he just thought, right, I'm doing something which is not me. I'm being anti-populist and I'm being pro-European, whatever. So I'll just leave one little sign that I haven't changed. The partially informed know that the British patron saint of populism, of the partially informed, is still in business. He's just playing a role. And we'll see whether the EU can somehow salvage some of the deal, but it seems to be an extremely rocky road ahead because the US President, it would seem to me, is unamenable to any kind of change of mind, simply because we may all sit here and say it's a mistake based on distortion, and he'll say, if it's based on distortion, it isn't a mistake.
Great, thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then what is it?
Not a duck.
That's right, it's a duck. But this duck is a nuclear duck. And it's time the world started calling a duck a duck. That is a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu speaking at AIPAC, the Israel Lobby's annual conference in 2012. And I wanted to share that quote with you because I think it does a good job of setting up what is at stake for many across the Middle East. A lot of states across the region have long been complicit in framing Iran as a quote-unquote existential threat. This goes back to the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the years afterwards, the recalibration of regional security. And I think that what this nuclear deal does is it raises the spectre of serious conflict across the Middle East, because for many, particularly in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, and in Jerusalem, in Israel, the deal didn't do enough to curtail Iranian activity, to curtail what was seen to be nefarious, perfidious Iranian activity across the Middle East. And one of the things that was really critical, that leaders were critical of the deal, particularly from the Middle East, was the sense that it didn't do enough to prevent Iranian involvement and support for non-state actors across the Middle East. So this perception that Iran was was supporting Hezbollah, the Lebanese Party of God. It was supporting Hamas in Gaza. The deal for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, didn't do enough to stop that type of activity. So for Israel and for the Saudis and other smaller Sunni Gulf states, the deal wasn't just about preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, although of course that was absolutely key. It was about reducing Iranian influence across the Middle East. Post-2011, Iran had begun to increase its influence across the region. And that was a cause of real concern to many. If we look at WikiLeaks cables, you see that a number of high-up Saudi officials, including the king, had long been urging the US to strike against Iranian targets, including the famous quote from King Abdullah urging the US to cut off the head of the snake. So there was a long-standing fear here, a long-standing concern that Iran was increasing its negative influence across the region. There's a great deal of framing, be it the nuclear deal, be it this construction of a Shia crescent, all doing the bidding of Iran from Tehran all the way across the region to Lebanon. Construction and framing of events in a particular way that was seen to be against the regional order. And the deal didn't do enough. It didn't do enough to curtail this activity. And you start to see, as the years passed after 2011, increasing Iranian involvement across the region, in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And this really worried the Israelis. It really worried the Saudis. And so when the deal was struck, there was a bit of hope for some that the deal was going to reduce that activity, bring Iran back into the diplomatic fold. But most worried that it was going to actually empower Iran. It was going to give them the opportunity to use their newfound economic wealth to continue to pour more money into groups like Hezbollah, into Hamas. And so what the deal did is it facilitated this regional realignment. It helped the leaders of Israel and Saudi Arabia to come together through this sense of a shared threat, through this sense of a shared Iranian threat, and the construction of narratives such as the Shia Crescent, the Iranian land bridge, this nuclear threat, brought the leaders together. And obviously under President Trump, that was aided through his personal politics, through the involvement of prominent Trump officials who were racking up air miles flying from Washington to Jerusalem and to Riyadh, trying to develop this new type of relationship. And this, I think, relationship is couched in shared fears about what Iran can do and what it will do. Predominantly on the sense that the nuclear deal didn't do enough to prevent Iran from wreaking havoc across the region. And this, of course, is a perception. This isn't a quantifiable truth, although you can point to Iranian support for groups like Hezbollah and for the Assad regime to see how there is this sense of Iranian involvement across the region. But this is the concern that many had. Iran was still acting in a nefarious way. The nuclear deal didn't do enough to stop Iran from doing this, from destabilizing the region, and so the Israelis, the Saudis, were pressuring the US to pull out. We've seen this happening for a long time. You look at Israeli rhetoric going back 10, 15 years, you will see prominent Israeli officials framing Iran as an existential threat. Same thing with the Saudis. And it's got to this point now where the US has pulled out of the deal, and there's an attempt to redraw the regional security landscape. And redrawing it is based on shared security concerns about what Iran can and cannot do. And I think I'll leave my section there and hand over to Samira, and I'll just load up your PowerPoint for you. So we're lucky to have Samira here, who will be able to talk a little bit about how the deal and the withdrawal from the deal has gone down in Iran.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone. Today I'm gonna present the Iranian perspective on the US withdrawal of the nuclear deal. Let's start with the public opinion about the nuclear program in Iran. As you see, the figures demonstrate the high majority of people in Iran support the nuclear program, and in 2015, 85% of Iranians mentioned that the nuclear program is very important for their country. And the surveys by Gallup and World Public Opinion shows that 77% of Iranians have an unfavorable view of the U.S. And what these surveys make clear is that the Iranians do not trust the U.S. And it is obvious after the U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal, it would increase the haters of the U.S. The U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal led to the sounds from Iran. Ayatollah Khamenei announced that without receiving strong guarantees from the European countries, we won't stick to the deal. And he also mentioned that he doesn't trust to these three countries. The President Rouhani said that U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal is the violation of the morals, and if the EU countries continue to abide the agreement, okay, Iran will remain in the nuclear deal. The Foreign Minister of Iran mentioned that Iran won't renegotiate, and he has started his diplomatic efforts to examine whether the remaining countries will ensure the benefits of Iran. And the outcome will determine the Iranian response within the weeks. Demonstrations in Iran in different cities was the public response to the U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal. Iranians denounced U.S. in protests, and it was the public response in Iran. As you mentioned, the JCPOA is a strategic multilateral agreement which endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, but the U.S. withdrawal was violation of this nuclear deal. From the initial stages, the purpose of the deal has been preventing Iran to be a nuclear weapon power. And as a result, the closed monitoring system by the IAEA has been issued 10 months from the nuclear program of Iran. International Atomic Energy Agency authorities has issued 10 times that Iran certified the nuclear-related commitments and are being implemented by Iran, and they verified the peaceful program of Iran, and in spite of the accusation of the U.S. and her allies, Israeli and Saudis, that Iran do not seek nuclear weapon, and it is a peaceful program. What's next? I'm going to take a look at two scenarios here. The first scenario is, okay, Iran won't renegotiate, and there is no plan B, and the EU countries will provide a strong guarantee to Iran, and they will remain in the nuclear deal. In this situation, the nuclear deal will preserve and continue with the remaining participants. The second scenario, in contrast, is EU cannot provide a strong guarantee, and sanctions will return, and Iran might respond by lifting the IAEA inspections and withdraw of NPT and restart the uranium enrichment. I'm going to quote a statement of the Foreign Minister of Iran. However, sanctions led to the suffering situation in Iran, but the sanctions made Iranian more stronger during 40 years. And Iran's head Office of Nuclear Energy Organization mentioned that Iran has capability to restart enrichment higher than before the nuclear deal. In this situation, if we got this situation, we will have the collapse of nuclear deal and will undermine the U.S. credibility and international agreements. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Samira. So we have about 20 minutes left for Q&A, for general discussions. And I guess the other thing that is sort of implied by a number of our presentations is that it's not just the Iran deal that's at stake, but it's international diplomacy generally. It's the future of any diplomatic efforts. This impact on trust building, an impact on the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1967, implemented in 1970. That was designed to prevent further proliferation of nuclear weapons, going back to JFK. Of course, the other thing that we've not explicitly mentioned is that Israel is not a signatory of the NPT, but has a nuclear weapons arsenal through its ambiguous nuclear opacity, in that this is a direct policy. Nuclear opacity is the worst/best kept secret that Israel has nuclear weapons, and that they pretend not to have them, and the world pretends to not to know that they do have them. But some might say, some such as Kent Walton say that it's a policy that's worked because there hasn't been a full-scale war since the early 70s. But anyway, that's another discussion. But I think it shows that there are a lot of things at stake, not only the deal itself and the reputation of Mr. Trump, Mrs. May, the survival of the Iranian state, but also that broader diplomatic dimension. So let's open the floor then. Take questions 2 or 3 at a time. So who'd like to kick us off? Shukrun Adel. Speak up for the recorder, please.
Okay.
That's okay.
Okay. To what extent is it possible to run the deal without United States from the perspective of international law?
Okay, thank you. Oh, well, sorry, should we take the second?
Oh, yeah, take the second question as well.
My second question is to Mark, actually, is if you can elaborate more about the Russian role in the whole game that's going around in the Middle East, mainly because the Russian said after the US pull out that they are ready to provide Iranian with the missile system, which is
Well,
the S-50 and S-500.
Well, I can give you a technical response to that first question, but then I think I might invite you to comment on the reality. Technically, if, according to the agreement as it was backed by the UN Security Council, if one state decides that they are going to discontinue participation and as a result, unilaterally imposes sanctions on Iran, then Iran would no longer be bound by the agreement. Okay, they could choose to remain bound by the agreement if they felt it was in their interests. But if the USA unilaterally imposes sanctions on Iran, then they would, under the terms of the agreement, be perfectly entitled to denounce the rest of it and therefore continue with unsupervised uranium enrichment, etc., etc. I don't know what the feeling is on the ground, though, as to whether that is a possible or desirable outcome.
Okay, I think as Foreign Minister of Iran many times mentioned that it is a Security Council resolution and it is the true violation of the treaty and agreement. But I think the U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal is totally different from the other participants in the EU. I don't think so about that. Yes, it would be.
Yeah, well, I think that question is more for Simon than for me, with his geopolitical hat.
You mentioned something about US and Britain, so why
Yeah.
Russia.
Well, why not throw Russia in? I mean, I would just say my own thing, Simon will have, but
So maybe you can comment after.
on behalf of the partially informed, I'll say that, I mean, there's obviously a community of interest between Iran and Russia anyway. There's obviously a long history of Russia wanting to be close to Iran or influential in Iran. You know, with the Assad, the Syria situation then, but this would seem to me to be another example of Russia, I don't like the phrase punching above its weight, but of Russia basically throwing a big rock into the pond and see where the ripples go. But behind it there is obviously a tendency for Iran and Russia to become closer. Simon?
No.
Oh, right, we'll have to leave it.
I will say just
Guesswork.
a very quick line. I mean, Russia is a signatory of the deal. It's involved in it as a member of the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So it is technically bound by the deal. One of the other criticisms of the deal was that it didn't do enough about restricting missile technology and the developments in the sort of the hardware side of things. And if Russia is getting involved in offering to support Iran with missile technology, then that would seem to be against, whether it's against the explicit clauses of the deal or whether it's against the spirit of the deal, it would seem to be sort of jeopardizing that. We know that Mr. Putin has long been involved in the Middle East for his own interests, but also sort of balancing out against US interests and US desires. We know that Russia and Iran have been working together. Whether the two actually go hand in hand, whether their long-term aims go hand in hand, I'm not convinced. I think that the two coalesce on certain issues, but the two adhere to completely different ideological positions. And I wouldn't necessarily agree that they share the same long-term vision for the organisation of the Middle East, but that they come together from time to time. But Samira and then...
Well, can I just say, just on your point about the hardware stuff there,
Yeah.
I will say, I probably should have said this during my presentation, but Article 3 of the preamble and general provisions of the Plan of Action say, Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop or require any nuclear weapons. That's probably quite central, I should have mentioned that. But you know, now that isn't to say they wouldn't do stuff behind the scenes, but that would be in breach of the agreement, and we know that if a country is in breach of the agreement, then the Security Council resolutions that are presently being suspended would be reactivated. Sure.
About the Russia, I'm gonna add this one that as a separate countries, Russia and China has had a very long-term business with Iran, and in the sanctions era, China and Russia helped Iran, and Iran purchased its oil to Russia and China. And I think there is 12 scenarios as mentioned by officials in Iran if after the US withdrawal, and there wouldn't be any guarantee of the EU countries that Iran had choices to do and separately and have deal with other countries in the Middle East or between EU countries.
So lots of options on the table. Tom and Richard and then Jack.
Okay, well thank you for very interesting perspectives, but I'm still, I guess, wondering a bit, you know, what you think the main sort of motivating factor was for the Trump administration in withdrawing from this deal. And, you know, I can entirely agree with what Mark said about playing to his base in the United States. Less convinced about the link with Brexit, but maybe we'll leave that to one side. What James was saying about the international law aspects, I mean, I entirely agree that you know, international law is very important to it, and it should be taken more seriously by governments, but I'd be surprised if James argued that it was concern for upholding international law and Iran's alleged breach of it that was the real driving force for the Trump administration. Simon mentioned Israel. You know, we know that Israel was lobbying strongly to torpedo the deal, and with support in the United States. How important was that factor? So there's these various things around, and I suppose particularly with sort of foreign policy objectives in the Middle East, which didn't come into it. I mean, so what's the main factor, if you had to sort of pinpoint one for the Trump administration?
And my point is actually very related to Tom's, which is, I mean, I think that there's more to the domestic policy side than just the reaction to experts. I mean, I think that that has given Trump the confidence to tear up the deal. But I think that, you know, there's a bit more method to the madness. I mean, I think on one aspect, you know, there's a major electoral constituency which wanted the US out of this deal, which was the evangelical community. And as President Trump has already in his first year delivered on 3 major asks from the evangelical community. They wanted an anti-abortion Supreme Court justice, they wanted the US Embassy moved to Jerusalem, and they wanted the Iran deal torn up. And I think that Trump, for all of his personal predilections, he received strong support from the evangelical community because they thought that he would give them policy concessions. And I think he's delivering on that. And then I think that the second point is that which comes to explain this is also that there's been a major personnel change in the executive branch. That Mike Pompeo coming in state has a much harder line, and in particular John Bolton coming in as National Security Advisor. And I think that makes me think that there's a longer pedigree to this than just Donald Trump. I mean, there's been a long-standing opposition to the Iran deal from the Republican Party, most of the Republican parties. The reason why Obama did put it forward as a treaty for approval by the Senate. So I think you have, in my view, you have a confluence of, you have long-standing Republican evangelical opposition to dealing with Iran, which they view as a rogue state, and then a president who doesn't trust experts and therefore is willing to actually make that leap and take the risk. But those would be my.
Thanks. And the question that.
Yeah, this is kind of for all of you. Yes. I was just wondering if there's any other dimensions other than the security only, sort of economic dimensions that play more into this than people would think. So I guess a bit more furtive, especially considering sort of Iranian revolution in the 50s and how economic interests played quite a large part in it, even though there wasn't really much talked about. I was wondering if, in this context, do you think that there is this sort of thing at play as well?
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, well, I mean, obviously, you, both Tom and Richard have, raised my presentation was extremely broad brush, uncharacteristically. However, and I'm sure the evangelical role, I mean, I think in a way, though, what you're saying is the same kind of thing. You're just isolating different bits of his domestic audience, which he was playing to. It's not simply what I've called the partially informed, it's also people who are very well informed and extremely biased, one might say. However, I'd also say that there is an argument, because this has been a Trump-bashing panel, at least some of it has, that if, in the wake of this deal certainly being undermined by the US, one of the results of that seems to be Iran reactivating a nuclear enrichment a uranium enrichment program. That seems to kind of partly make Mr. Trump's argument, because Mr. Trump's argument is that you can't believe Iran, that it's going to actually, that it's got peaceful intentions. And Trump could say that if their retaliation to this deal being unravelled to some extent is to basically start doing things which point towards a non-peaceful nuclear program, they always had that intention anyway, and that the agreement was really a fig leaf to. So that's a dangerous element of this, that if Iran replies with saber rattling, it is actually helping to make Mr. Trump's case for it. On the economic issue, I mean, there's an awful lot of discussion when these kind of things happen about who benefits and is there an oil angle to it, and clearly in the 1950s, Britain and America, that's absolutely obvious where the interests lie. I mean, one thing you may want to say is that if Iran is unable to export oil, I mean, if that was something to do with Mr. Trump's thinking, whereas we know it can export its oil maybe to China, wherever, but if it was trying to get Iran's oil off the market, it may well be that that's to the benefit of Saudi Arabia, and therefore you could say that Mr. Trump's gesture has been, a gift for Saudi Arabia to keep oil prices reasonably high, and Saudi Arabia can pump out the oil that Iran can't export anymore, and it will do so at a slightly higher price. But also, of course, America, thanks to fracking, etc., doesn't need to worry about the oil market quite so much. So there's always an economic... that guy Marx occasionally, has insights which, even though his views on Brexit were really bad. Anyway, so, you're going to go on the economic one?
No.
You're not, right.
No, do you want to comment now, or shall I talk about US foreign policy in the Middle East?
Okay, well, I'll say something really brief, but once again, I'll hand over to you, if I may, afterwards. Mark, you said something to the effect that was Iran going to develop uranium regardless of this agreement or not?
Well, I'm saying that's what Mr. Trump says,
Yeah,
and some things that have been said subsequently may be seen as actually helping Mr. Trump's case.
That's right, but the way I see this agreement, it was both carrot and stick. The carrot being the suspension but not removal of the sanctions, with a very clear threat to reintroduce them instantly were Iran to be in breach of the agreement. But question for you, Samira, was, during the time of the sanctions, they had an effect, yeah? People don't want to go back to that, I guess.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But I told the quotation of the Prime Minister of Iran that for 40 years Iran has been sanctioned, but Iran, the sanctions doesn't work for Iran, and it made Iranian more stronger. But the reality is that Iran needs to export oil, and there are still China, Russia there, and many specific question from the beginning of the U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal is that who benefits this withdrawal? And it is your major, but I want to interrupt your expertise. I think I want to mix with the question of that domestic policy and what was the motivation of the U.S. withdrawal. I think the domestic policy and foreign policy, domestic policy overshadows on the foreign policy and vice versa. And the motivation by the Trump to withdraw from the nuclear deal from the beginning of the deal was that the push of Israeli, and they was disagree with this deal. And if you see just Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the Israeli just support the U.S. withdrawal of the nuclear deal. But I think the rest of the world, they agree with being in the deal. And it was for 12 years that the negotiations were under the table and the diplomatic efforts. And I think it's the suspension of the sanctions and the negotiations with the EU countries, and if the EU countries decide to give guarantee for Iran, and okay, Iran will remain in the deal and benefits from the suspension of the sanctions.
I'll just say a couple of very quick things. Last year I served as an academic advisor to a House of Lords committee on the international relations of the Middle East and British relations with the Middle East. And one of the key themes was, or one of the key worries I should say, was what is Trump going to do? Is he going to pull out of the nuclear deal? Will he renegotiate? What will he try and do? And it was a big concern because the UK played a really prominent role in getting that deal off the ground, in making the deal happen. So that was a key concern. But it was underpinned by a real uncertainty as to what foreign policy was going to be like under Mr. Trump, what the US foreign policy was going to look like. Because I think what we see very quickly is that there's a marked shift in the trajectory of US foreign policy from Obama to Trump, where Obama was certainly in favour of reconciliation, in favour of dialogue. He gave a really interesting interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic where he talked about the Saudis and the Iranians sharing the region. And he was very critical of the Saudis, very critical of the Israelis historically, and that was much to the chagrin of domestic audiences, the evangelicals, the Republicans, the Israelis and the Saudis, they were all very critical of Obama. And many in the Gulf were pretty happy to see him gone, to be honest. They liked the idea of Trump coming in and having someone that they could work with, a businessman who understood the importance of transactions and positive individual leader-on-leader relations. So there are a lot of concerns there. And I think that the other thing is, I can't remember who it was that flagged it up, but the change of staff, I think it was you, Richard, the change of staff in terms of in state, the people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And Bolton in particular was heavily involved in the Iraq War. He was heavily involved in trying to sort out the mess of post-invasion Iraq. He saw what the Iranians had done. He saw what Iranian actors had done across the Iraqi state. He saw what Iranian-supported militias had done. He was involved with people who lost their lives there. So he was obviously very anti-Iranian. And so I think when you put all of this together, this uncertainty, these concerns domestically, these concerns regionally, this pressure from external sources and internal sources, and personal experience, you've got this whole melange of factors that pushed Trump down this type of line, rightly or wrongly. Okay, we are rapidly out of time. Do we have time for one last question? Mujan, you had your hand up first. Sorry.
So I kind of want to pick up on everything that was said, which is quite difficult to say. But in terms of John Bolton, I mean, you mentioned his views on against Iran because of his involvement in Iraq. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that he has been the speaker for the MEK, and that kind of lobby is there. And we can't ignore the kind of elephant in the room when we talk about US pulling out of the deal, about their idea of pushing regime change in Iran, right? Which for me kind of ties in with what you, Samira, were talking about in terms of domestic issues overshadowing foreign policy. We can't ignore the kind of thing that is going on in Iran. There is that mention that, sure, sanctions made Iran stronger, but I'm not sure how much I buy that because ordinary people were the ones who suffered. And I'm not going to talk about oil or that kind of thing, but medicine, right? That was a big thing. And I wonder, because Iranians at the moment, they are kind of wondering, well, how much did the nuclear deal actually do for us? Because a lot of people can't feel the effects of it. And I wonder how much they would be willing, especially in light of the protests that have been happening in Iran since December, how much they would be willing to back whatever scenario, as you laid out, they would back their government in their efforts. I mean, I can see that they would probably be pro scenario 1, but scenario 2, I have really, strong difficulty seeing how the Iranian government and the regime would be able to have the backing of the public, and what happens if they don't.
Thank you. Mr. Trump, the president of US, mentioned that the sanctions is just for correcting the Iranian government or Iranian regime. But to be honest, no, it is to affect the Iranian people, and the sanctions will affect the Iranian people. And I think it is that you mentioned that here what they want to say, and the foreign minister has started his diplomatic efforts to, as he mentioned, have the Iranian rights, and it is that they want to remain in the nuclear deal. But the violation was from the US, and it is that there are many cases that the US has violation examples, but not Iran. And I think the public opinion are convinced about that it is not Iran, I think. But I'm telling you that Iranian will suffer from the sanctions if they want to return.
Okay, before I thank you all for coming, a quick announcement that there is an event put on by the law school, which is going to take place at 3 o'clock.
That's right. So 3 o'clock today in Bowland North Seminar Room 5, I'm giving a work in progress seminar about my actual work. There will be basically no law in it, but we will be discussing the concepts of justice. particularly in relation to post-conflict or transitional environments, because I'm doing a British Academy-funded project that's carrying out empirical work to look at the role of journalists in constructing and challenging the historical record in times of transition. In so-called transitional justice, which is what I kind of study most of the time, the idea of setting and challenging the historical record in order to satisfy victims of a prior regime is a big deal. And so, as I say, I'm carrying out some research at the moment on the role of journalists, in particular in Kosovo. So anyway, you are all very welcome to attend, and that's, as I say, 3 o'clock in Bowler North, seminar room 5. Thank you.
Mark, anything else you want to add, plug?
Oh, well, the impact narrative available in all good computer screens, wherever.
Indeed.
Which is me and Simon just blabbering on about stuff. And it's a podcasty thing.
That's well put. And last thing, thank you to my colleagues on the panel, and thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you.